I'm going to tell you something that sounds crazy about the people you love, about how much pain you'll take just to keep them close. There is a memory seared behind my eyes, a single, perfect frame of film playing on an endless loop. It's a vision of my son's smile. Not the one from his childhood, all missing teeth and unrestrained joy, but a placid, polite, almost vacant smile he wore as the woman he loved held a metaphorical knife to my throat and twisted it, slowly. The question that has haunted every waking moment since isn't why she did it. Cruelty, I've learned, can be as casual as breathing for some people. The real question, the one that lodges in my chest like a shard of glass, is why he let her. Was it weakness? Was it a calculated act of cruelty I never imagined he possessed? Or was it something I had simply failed to see for 28 years? A profound and terrifying darkness hiding in the one person I believed was made of pure light? This isn't just a story about a cruel remark. It's the story of how I discovered that the person I loved most in this world was a stranger, and how the life I thought I had built was a beautiful, elaborate lie, poised to shatter at the slightest touch. It's the story of how everything I thought was real came undone in a single, perfectly enunciated sentence. My name is Alara. At the time this story begins, I was 58 years old, and my world was circumscribed by the gentle shores of Canandaigua Lake, in a small township called Serenity Falls, deep in the wine country of upstate New York. My life was measured in the turning of the potter's wheel and the low, constant hum of the kiln in my studio, a converted barn I called the kiln on Hemlock Creek. For 20 years since my husband Alistair passed, my hands were my compass. They were rarely clean, perpetually coated in a fine, pale dust of kaolin and feldspar, the ghost of clay forever settled under my fingernails. I found a quiet sort of truth in the earth, a stability that the world of people often failed to provide. My guiding belief was simple, perhaps naive, that love, particularly a mother's love for her child, was an elemental force, an unbreakable shield against the worst of the world. I was about to learn how fragile that shield truly was. My son, Oren, was the center of that universe. He was the sun I orbited, the anchor that kept my little world from drifting away after Alistair was gone. He was a good boy, a good man. Or so I believed. Our bond was forged in the quiet aftermath of loss, solidified by shared grief and the unspoken promise to be each other's harbor. I remember him as a child, his small hand gripping mine as we walked the slate-strewn shore of the lake, hunting for the smoothest skipping stones. We had a special place, a flat outcropping of shale we called Whispering Rock, where he would tell me his secrets, the name of the girl he liked in 3rd grade, his fear of thunderstorms, his dream of one day building bridges that would stand for 1,000 years. I held those secrets like sacred texts. As he grew, our connection didn't fray, it deepened. He'd come home from college and spend hours in my studio, not saying much, just sitting on an old wooden stool, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, while I worked. He understood the silent language of my craft. He knew the precise moment a pot was centered on the wheel, the point of perfect equilibrium before it could be shaped. He was my equilibrium. He'd tell me about his engineering classes, his eyes bright with a passion for physics and form, and I would see his father in him. That same quiet intensity, that same kind, steady heart. He was my masterpiece, the finest thing I had ever helped create. Far more enduring than any vessel I could fire into permanence. Then Isolde entered his life. She was a whirlwind. Oren brought her home to Serenity Falls about a year after they met in the city, where he'd taken a job with a prestigious architectural firm. She was luminous, impeccably dressed, with a voice as smooth and cool as polished marble. She smelled of something I couldn't quite place, a perfume like night-blooming jasmine and cold money. She was an art consultant for wealthy collectors, a world away from my dusty barn and earth-stained hands. I wanted to love her. I truly did. For Oren's sake, I would have embraced a dragon if it made him happy, and he was deliriously happy. He looked at her as if she had personally arranged the stars in the sky just for him. So I tried. I invited her into my studio, showed her the delicate process of throwing porcelain, the alchemy of transforming mud into something fine and translucent. She watched with a poised curiosity, her eyes scanning my work, my tools, my life, with an unnerving, assessing quality. "It's all so rustic," she said once, her lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her gaze. So wonderfully authentic. I didn't know then that to people like her, authentic was just a polite word for quaint or poor. There were other things, tiny splinters under the skin that I tried to ignore. A passing comment she made about the local wine from our region being palatable for a domestic. A subtle glance at my worn but comfortable furniture. I told myself I was being overprotective, a mother seeing threats where there were none. Orrin saw none of it. He was enchanted. He saw her intelligence, her ambition, her poise. And because he saw it, I forced myself to see it too. I mistook her ambition for passion, her poise for grace. 6 months later, they were engaged. Orrin called me, his voice effervescent with a joy I hadn't heard since he was a boy on Christmas morning. He was getting married. He was bringing his fiancée, soon to be his wife, to meet her family at their estate on Long Island. And they wanted me to come. It was to be a formal introduction, a weekend at their ancestral home, a place they called Graymarsh. My heart seized with a peculiar mix of pride and a low, thrumming anxiety. This was it. The moment my world would officially merge with hers. I knew I wouldn't fit in. I was a woman of earth and clay, of quiet mornings by a lake. Her family, as Orrin had explained with a kind of detached awe, were the Athertons. Old money. Their lineage was traced back to shipping magnates and steel barons. They were a different species entirely. They're going to love you, Mom. Orrin insisted over the phone, his voice a warm balm on my nerves. Just be yourself. But how could I be myself in a world I couldn't possibly comprehend? I decided I would bring a piece of myself with me. A gift. Not something bought, but something made. Something that spoke the only language I was truly fluent in. For weeks, I dedicated myself to creating the perfect offering. I decided on a set of 7 celadon glazed porcelain bowls, each one thrown so thin you could almost see the light through it. The glaze, a pale, ethereal green, was a notoriously difficult color to achieve, requiring a perfect firing, a perfect balance of heat and reduction. I called it the Serenity Set. Each bowl was a prayer for my son's happiness, a piece of my soul fired into permanence. As I worked the clay, centering it on the wheel, I felt I was trying to center my own fears, to shape them into something beautiful and acceptable. The kiln fired perfectly. The set was flawless. It was the finest work I had ever done. The week of the trip, my anxiety grew into a quiet dread. I packed and repacked my small suitcase, my simple, practical clothes looking more and more inadequate with each fold. Orrin and Isolde drove up from the city to fetch me. He was beaming, oblivious. She was polite, her smile practiced and precise. As we loaded my things into their sleek, silver car. A vehicle that cost more than my studio. She eyed the carefully wrapped box containing the bowls. A housewarming gift? She asked, her tone light. Something like that, I replied. A gift for your parents. To thank them for their hospitality. She nodded, that same unreadable smile playing on her lips. How thoughtful. The drive was 5 hours of watching the world transform. The familiar, rolling hills and vineyards of the Finger Lakes gradually flattened into the endless sprawl of suburbia, which in turn gave way to the manicured, imposing wealth of Long Island's North Shore. We turned off the main road onto a winding lane shrouded by ancient, towering oaks. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, scented with salt and money. Orrin chattered excitedly, pointing out landmarks, telling me stories he'd heard from Isolde about the neighboring estates and the families who lived in them. I barely heard him. I was watching Isolde. She was changing too. With every mile closer to her home, her posture seemed to straighten, her polite demeanor hardening into an armor of cool, confident superiority. It was a subtle shift, a chilling metamorphosis. Finally, we reached a pair of immense wrought iron gates, flanked by stone pillars topped with unblinking eagles. The name Graymarsh was elegantly carved into the stone. As the gates swung silently, electronically inward, the estate revealed itself. It wasn't a house. It was a testament to power. A sprawling stone manor that looked less like a home and more like a museum, surrounded by acres of lawn so unnaturally green and perfect it looked like a carpet rolled out to the edge of the gray, churning sound. Orrin pulled the car to a stop on a circular gravel driveway in front of a massive, dark wood door. He turned to me, his face alight with a boyish excitement that was so painfully at odds with the intimidating grandeur of the place. He didn't see the fortress, he saw his future. He squeezed my hand, his grip warm and strong. "Ready, Mom," he whispered, his smile wide and genuine. I looked from his trusting face to the cold, imposing facade of the house, and I felt a tremor of fear, profound and primal. I clutched the box containing my porcelain bowls, my offering of peace, my small piece of Serenity Falls. It felt impossibly fragile. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of my heart, I nodded. "I'm ready." I had no idea what I was walking into. I had no idea that I was stepping across a threshold into a place where my entire life, and my understanding of the son I had raised, would be systematically, cruelly, and permanently dismantled. The great wooden door of Grey Marsh swung open without a sound, revealing a man who seemed as much a part of the house as the stone walls. He was tall and impossibly thin, dressed in a simple black suit, his face a mask of polite indifference. He introduced himself as Fenwick, the house steward. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint, clean scent of lemon oil and old paper. The foyer was a cavern of marble and dark wood, larger than the entire ground floor of my small house back in Serenity Falls. A grand staircase swept upwards into shadow, and on the wall above it hung a portrait of a stern-faced woman in dark silk, her painted eyes seeming to follow our entry with silent judgment. There was no clutter, no sign of life. It was a space designed not for living, but for display. My worn leather boots suddenly felt clumsy and loud on the polished floor. I clutched the box containing my bowls tighter. The smooth cardboard a small, familiar comfort in this cold, alien cathedral. Looking at Oren, I saw he was not intimidated. He was captivated. He gazed at the soaring ceiling, the intricate woodwork, the sheer unapologetic scale of it all. This was the world of engineering and design he'd always dreamed of made manifest. This was a structure built to last 1,000 years. Beside him, Isolde had completed her transformation. She moved with an innate fluid ownership of the space, handing her coat to Fenwick without a glance. She belonged here. And as I stood there, a potter from a small town on a lake, I felt a chasm opening between my son and me, a distance measured not in miles, but in worlds. To understand the depth of that chasm, you have to understand the bridge we had built across it, stone by painstaking stone, over the course of his entire life. That bridge was founded in the silence that followed my husband Alistair's death. Oren was only 10. The illness had been a thief in the night, quick and merciless, leaving our small house on Hemlock Creek feeling hollowed out, echoing with the absence of his father's quiet laugh. Grief, I discovered, is not a storm. It is a change in the weather. It is a permanent graying of the sky. For weeks, Oren was silent. He retreated into himself, building intricate structures with his Legos, tiny, perfect worlds where everything fit together and nothing ever broke. I watched him from the doorway of his room, my own sorrow a physical weight that made it hard to breathe, terrified that I was losing him too. My studio, the kiln, became my sanctuary and my salvation. The physical, demanding nature of the work, wedging 100-pound blocks of clay, the constant rhythm of the wheel, the intense focus required to pull a delicate wall of porcelain, was the only thing that could quiet the noise in my head. One afternoon, weeks after the funeral, Oren came into the studio and stood by the door watching me. He didn't say a word. He just watched my hands as they coaxed a shapeless lump of gray mud into a tall, clean cylinder. After a long while, he walked over, picked up a small scrap of clay I'd trimmed off, and began to work it in his small hands. From that day on, it became our ritual. He would do his homework at the old pine table in the corner, and then he would sit with me, sometimes talking, mostly not, just sharing the quiet space. He learned the language of my work. He learned the names: stoneware, earthenware, porcelain. He learned about oxides and glazes, about the difference between a bisque firing and a glaze firing. He understood the heartbreak of opening the kiln after a 12-hour cycle to find a hairline crack in your best piece. He understood the patience it required, the acceptance of imperfection. More than that, he became my anchor. When I'd get lost in my grief, working late into the night until my shoulders ached, he would appear with a glass of water and say, "Mom, it's centered. You can stop now." He knew. He always knew. Our other sanctuary was the lake. We'd walk for hours along the shore, past the crooked docks and the summer cottages boarded up for the season. We resurrected our old spot, Whispering Rock, and gave it a new purpose. It was where we went to talk to Alistair. I would tell him about my latest commission, about a problem with the kiln. Orrin would tell him about his science fair project, about making the varsity soccer team. We'd skip stones across the flat, gray water, counting the bounces, each ripple a message sent out into the quiet. It was there on that rock that he told me he wanted to be an engineer. He didn't want to just build things. He wanted to build bridges. Things that connect people, Mom, he'd said, his 14-year-old face so earnest and serious. Things that last. I saw his father in him so clearly in that moment, it stole my breath. Alistair had been a stonemason, a man who built foundations. My son wanted to build the connections between them. As he grew into a young man, he never grew distant. He became my partner in a way. When a brutal winter storm knocked out our power for a week and a pipe burst, flooding a corner of the studio and ruining 200 pounds of clay, he was the one who stayed up with me, bailing water with buckets, his face set with a fierce determination. I remember sinking onto a stool, exhausted and defeated, on the verge of tears. He put his hand on my shoulder, his grip strong and sure. "It's just mud, Mom," he said gently. "We can always get more mud. The foundation is still good." My son, the builder. He was right. The foundation was good. Our foundation was good. Or so I believed. He went off to Cornell, and the house fell quiet again, but our bond held fast. He'd call every Sunday, and his first question was always, "How's the kiln running?" When he described his classes on structural dynamics and material science, I heard the same passion I felt when talking about the molecular structure of a perfect celadone glaze. We were both makers, just in different mediums. He was my proudest creation, a structure of kindness and integrity, built on a foundation of love. The first time he told me about Isolde, it was one of those Sunday calls. His voice had a different timbre, a kind of breathless excitement I hadn't heard before. He'd met her at a gallery opening his firm had sponsored. He described her as if she were a marvel of physics. "She's just perfectly balanced, Mom. Brilliant and beautiful, and she knows exactly who she is." He was smitten, and I was happy for him. Of course I was. A part of me, the selfish, lonely part, felt a small, cold prick of fear. The weather was changing again. Their first visit to Serenity Falls was in the autumn. The hills around the lake were on fire with color. I cooked for days, preparing all of Orrin's childhood favorites. Isolde was just as he'd described. Stunningly beautiful, impeccably dressed, and radiating a confidence that was both dazzling and intimidating. I took them to my favorite local restaurant, a place called the Gilded Perch, which overlooked the lake. It was a cozy, unpretentious place with the best food in the county. Isolde studied the menu with a faint, quizzical smile. "It's charming," she said, the word hanging in the air. Over dinner, she asked about my work. I tried to explain the joy I found in it, the connection to the earth, the quiet satisfaction of making something beautiful and useful with my own hands. "So it's a wonderful hobby," she concluded, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "It's my profession," I corrected gently. "It's how I've paid the mortgage for the last 20 years. "Of course," she said quickly, her smile not faltering. "I just mean it's so fulfilling to have a creative outlet like that. My career is much more analytical. I broker collections. We're currently negotiating the acquisition of a Rothko for a client in Dubai. The logistics are a nightmare, but the stakes are thrilling." I saw Orrin watch her as she spoke, his expression full of admiration. He didn't seem to notice the subtle dismissal, the clear line she had drawn between her important career and my quaint hobby. He just saw the brilliant, powerful woman he adored. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "My mom's a legend," he said, winking at me. "People come from all over for her work." It was meant to defend me, but it felt like he was translating, trying to make me legible to her, to validate my life in terms she might understand. It was the first time I felt he was standing between us, not beside me. There were other moments, small but sharp. A comment about how Orrin must be so relieved to finally have a proper city life, after growing up in such a quiet place. a polite refusal of a slice of my homemade apple pie, with a murmur about its rustic carbohydrate profile. Each one was a tiny paper cut, insignificant on its own, but together, they left a stinging unease. Oren never seemed to notice. Or if he did, he chose to ignore it, to smooth over the awkward silences with a cheerful change of subject. He was building a bridge to her, and if the foundation on my side had to be chipped away a little to make it fit, he seemed to think it was a fair price. Which brought me back to the cold, marble foyer of Grey Marsh, holding my box of handmade bowls. This gift, the Serenity Set, was my last best attempt to speak my own language in this foreign land. It was my way of saying, "This is who I am. This is where your son comes from. This earth, this patience, this love." I hoped her parents, the Athertons, might understand the value of something made with care, something that couldn't be bought or brokered. "Mother? Father?" Isolde's voice, crisp and clear, echoed in the cavernous hall. "They're here." Two figures emerged from a dimly lit corridor that branched off the main hall. They didn't hurry. Their approach was measured, regal. Her father, Caspian Atherton, was tall and silver-haired, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in a cold wind. Her mother, Lenora, was slender and elegant, wrapped in a cashmere shawl the color of cream. Her expression a careful blend of patrician grace and utter disinterest. They stopped a few feet from us, their eyes taking me in, from my sensible shoes to my simple dress to the nervous way I clutched my cardboard box. It wasn't a glance, it was an appraisal, evaluation. And I could feel, with a sinking certainty, that I had been found wanting. Caspian's eyes flicked to Oren, a flicker of something that might have been approval. "Oren, good to see you." He shook my son's hand firmly. Lenora offered a cool, dry hand to me, her touch as brief and weightless as a falling leaf. "A pleasure to finally meet you," she said, her voice a low, melodious murmur that carried no warmth whatsoever. This was the moment. My heart hammered against my ribs. I held out my gift. I brought you something," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast space. "To thank you for having me. I made them myself." Lenora took the box, her perfectly manicured eyebrows raising a fraction of an inch. She lifted the lid, revealing the 7 porcelain bowls nestled in the packing straw, their celadone glaze glowing softly even in the dim light. For a moment, there was only silence. I held my breath, searching their faces for any sign of appreciation, any acknowledgement of the weeks of work, the heart I had poured into them. Caspian peered into the box. "Pottery," he stated, his tone flat, as if identifying a vaguely interesting rock. Lenora looked from the bowls to me, and then to her daughter. A small, knowing smile touched the corner of her lips. It was a smile I was beginning to recognize. It was Isolde's smile, perfected over a generation. It was the smile of a queen observing a peasant's crude, but earnest, offering. And it was then, in that cold, silent foyer, that Isolde chose to make her introduction, to translate me for them, to place me in their world. She stepped forward, gesturing towards me with a sweep of her hand, her voice ringing with the clear, cutting confidence of a person who has never once in her life been uncertain of her own power. Time seemed to stretch and thin in the cold marble hall. I stood there, holding my breath, my gaze fixed on Lenora Atherton's face as she stared down at my gift. The 7 celadone bowls, which had felt like radiant pieces of my soul back in the warm, familiar light of my studio, now looked like humble, muddy things. They were artifacts from another world, and they were not welcome here. Lenora's lips, a thin, perfect line of deep crimson, tightened almost imperceptibly. She did not touch the bowls. She simply closed the lid of the box with a soft, final click, the sound echoing in the unnerving silence. It was a dismissal, a verdict. My eyes darted to Oren, a silent plea for him to say something, to bridge this sudden, terrifying gap. He stood slightly behind Isolde, his expression a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. He was watching the Athertons, not me. He was waiting for their approval, so desperate for them to see what he saw in this life, in this woman, that he had become blind to everything else. He was a builder, my son, and in that moment, he was building his new life on the foundation of my own humiliation. He just didn't know it yet. Isolde saw the verdict in her mother's eyes. She saw the social calculus play out in an instant. She saw my offering, my earnest handmade peace treaty, not as a gift but as a liability. A piece of evidence marking her fiancé, and by extension herself, as originating from something common. Something rustic. She had a choice. She could have smoothed it over, offered a polite compliment, and moved on. She could have built a bridge. But Isolde, I was learning, was not a builder. She was a demolitions expert. She turned, her movements fluid and deliberate, positioning herself between me and her parents. She placed a proprietary hand on Oren's arm, a gesture of ownership. Her smile was radiant, a weaponized charm designed to captivate and command. Her eyes, however, when they flickered to me, were as cold and clear as ice. She was about to define me for them, to place me in their social taxonomy, and she was going to make sure I was pinned at the very bottom. "Mother, father," she began, her voice resonating with a bright, theatrical clarity. "I'm so sorry we haven't had a proper chance to introduce you. This is Alara." She paused, letting my name hang in the air for a moment, an unremarkable sound. Then she gestured towards me, not with a welcoming sweep, but with a flick of her wrist, a gesture one might use to point out a piece of furniture. And then she delivered the line, the sentence that cleaved my life into a before and an after. "Oren has told me she was quite the beauty in her youth," Isolde said, her smile widening as she addressed her parents, but her words aimed directly at my heart. "But as you can see, the years and the country cooking have caught up. It's a shame, really." She then turned her gaze fully on me, her eyes locking with mine, and with a small, dismissive laugh that sounded like chipping ice, she added for the room to hear. "He failed to mention he was bringing a fat pig home for the weekend." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds disconnected from meaning. Fat pig. It was so crude, so blunt, so utterly out of place coming from those perfectly painted lips. It was a line from a different kind of story, a brutal, ugly story. But it had been spoken. It was real. It hung in the pristine, lemon-scented air of Grey Marsh, an indelible stain. And then, the world fractured. Sound faded away. The grand foyer seemed to tilt on its axis. The stern face of the woman in the portrait above the stairs swam in my vision. I felt a strange, buzzing sensation in my ears, the sound of my own blood roaring in protest. I could feel the heat rising in my face, a deep, painful blush of shame so intense it felt like a physical blow. I looked down at my body, at the simple blue dress I had thought was perfectly acceptable, at my hands, the hands of a maker, which suddenly felt coarse and useless. For the first time in my life, I felt utterly and completely exposed, judged, and condemned, not for anything I had done, but for the simple, unforgivable sin of who I was. In that silent, screaming moment, my gaze snapped to the only person in the room who mattered. My son. My Oren. My anchor. I looked to him for my rescue. I expected to see shock, outrage, a flash of righteous anger in his eyes. I expected him to step forward, to put his arm around me, to defend me with the ferocity I knew he possessed. I expected his voice, strong and clear, to cut through Isolde's venom and say, "Don't you ever speak to my mother that way again." I expected him to take my hand and lead me out of that cold, monstrous house and never look back. He was my protector. He was the boy who had bailed water with me in the dead of night, who had promised me the foundation was still good. But that is not what I saw. What I saw will be seared into my memory until the day I die. Oren was standing exactly where he had been, with Isolde's hand still resting on his arm, and he was smiling. It wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't a gloating smile. It was something infinitely worse. It was a small, tight social smile, a placating, agreeable little twitch of the lips. It was the smile of someone at a cocktail party who has just heard a mildly off-color joke and doesn't want to make a scene. It was the smile of a coward. He glanced from Isolde to her parents, a flicker of appeasement in his eyes, as if to say, "It's okay. This is just how they are. Let's not cause any trouble." He said nothing. He did nothing. He just stood there and smiled like nothing happened while the woman he loved gutted his mother in front of him. And in his silence, in that polite, vacant smile, I heard a sound louder than any shout. It was the sound of our bridge, The one we had built for 28 years out of shared grief and skipping stones and late nights in the studio, cracking down the middle. It was the sound of my son choosing. He was choosing her. He was choosing this cold marble house. He was choosing their world over mine. And he was choosing it with a smile. I tore my eyes from him and looked at the Athertons. They too were unmoved. Caspian's granite face was impassive. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if mildly amused by his daughter's audacity. Lenora's expression was one of faint, clinical approval. This was a test, I realized, and Isolde had passed with flying colors. She had demonstrated her loyalty to their world, to their values, by swiftly and brutally dispatching the threat of my otherness. It was a tribal ritual, and I was the sacrifice. My son, the man I raised to build things that last, just stood by and watched me burn. A fundamental violation of trust is too sterile a phrase for what happened in that room. It was a desecration. It was an act of profound spiritual violence. If you believe what Isolde did was a fundamental violation of trust, comment. Human dignity is non-negotiable. Below to declare where you stand. I needed to know in that moment that the world I came from, a world where kindness and respect were the currencies that mattered, still existed somewhere beyond these cold stone walls. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a narrative that made sense. Was he afraid of them? Was he so blinded by love that he couldn't see the cruelty? Or was this something else? Was this who he was now? Had this glittering, venomous world already poisoned him so completely? I thought of him as a boy at Whispering Rock, his face so open and earnest, telling me his secrets. And I looked at the man standing there in his expensive suit, smiling his empty smile. And I saw a stranger. The connection I had cherished as the one unbreakable thing in my life was not just broken. I was being forced to consider the horrifying possibility that it had never been as strong as I believed. That it was a story I had told myself because I needed it to be true. Fenwick. Lenora's calm voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. Please show Alara to the guest suite in the East Wing. And take her offering. She gestured at the box in my hands. The box containing my serenity set. My prayers for my son's happiness. The house steward materialized at my side, his face as impassive as his employer's. He reached for the box. For a second, my fingers refused to let go. My knuckles were white. This box was the last piece of my world I had left. It was a symbol of my love, my work, my entire identity. Handing it over felt like a final surrender. But what choice did I have? My son wasn't going to save me. My muscles went slack, and I let Fenwick take it from me. He held it as if it were a soiled object he was removing from the room. This way, madam, he said, his voice a low monotone. I took a step, then another. My legs felt like they were moving through deep water. I didn't look at Oren again. I couldn't. To see that smile again would have shattered what little composure I had left. I walked past the grand staircase, past the judgmental eyes of the woman in the portrait, and followed the silent steward down a long, echoing corridor. With every step, I felt myself shrinking, my world collapsing inward until all that was left was the ringing in my ears and the four brutal, echoing words. The introduction from which I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, there could be no recovery. The East Wing guest suite was a masterpiece of silent, opulent indifference. The walls were the color of old parchment, the carpet so thick my footsteps made no sound. A four-poster bed of dark, polished Zebrano wood stood in the center of the room, its white linens turned down with a crisp geometric precision. There was a sitting area by a large window that overlooked a manicured garden. Every hedge and flower bed arranged in a perfect, joyless pattern. The air was still and smelled faintly of dried lavender and beeswax. It was the most beautiful room I had ever been in, and it felt like a tomb. There was no life here. No books left open, no stray coffee mugs, no sign that a human being had ever simply existed in this space. It was a room for display, just like the foyer, just like the family that inhabited it. Fenwick placed my box, my serenity set, on a luggage rack at the foot of the bed. Dinner is at 8, he said, his voice a flat, empty vessel. Mrs. Atherton prefers formal attire. He then turned and left, closing the door behind him with a quiet, heavy click that sounded like a lock turning. I stood frozen in the center of the room, the silence pressing in on me. The words, a fat pig, echoed in the stillness, replaying themselves with a vicious, relentless clarity. My body began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that started in my bones. I wrapped my arms around myself, but I couldn't get warm. I felt a desperate, primal urge to flee, to run out of that house and not stop until I could smell the damp earth and fresh water of Hemlock Creek. But I was trapped. I had no car, no knowledge of this place. I was a castaway on an island of hostile wealth, sinking onto the edge of the perfectly made bed. I stared at the cardboard box. My gift. My offering. It looked so out of place here, so humble and plain amidst the polished wood and expensive fabrics. It was me. It was my world, sitting there in a plain brown box, judged and discarded. A hot, stinging shame washed over me again, so powerful it made me nauseous. I had spent a lifetime building a quiet confidence in myself, in my work, in the value of a life lived simply and honestly. Isolde had demolished it in a single sentence. And my son, my Oren, had watched her do it, with a smile. The smile. That was the part one couldn't process. The cruelty from Isolde, I could almost understand. I was an intruder in her world, a symbol of a past she wanted to erase. But Oren. My mind scrambled for an explanation, a foothold of logic in the swirling chaos of my emotions. He was shocked. He was paralyzed by fear. He didn't know what to say. He was trying to keep the peace. I clung to these excuses like a drowning woman clutching at driftwood. He would come. He would knock on the door, his face full of shame and regret. He would apologize, he would explain, he would make it right. He had to. The alternative was unthinkable. The alternative meant that the son I knew was gone. The minutes stretched into an eternity. I listened to the faint, ancient groans of the great house, the distant whisper of the wind against the windowpane. Every sound was a potential footstep, the harbinger of my son's arrival. Hope and dread waged a war in my chest. Finally, after what felt like hours, there was a soft knock on the door. My heart leaped. He's here. I took a shaky breath and opened it. Oren stood in the hallway, his hands shoved in his pockets. He had changed into a dark suit and tie. He wasn't looking at me, but at a spot on the carpet just past my shoulder. He still had that tight, uneasy look on his face. "Hey Mom," he said, his voice low. "I just wanted to see if you were okay." The relief that flooded through me was so intense it almost buckled my knees. I pulled him into the room and closed the door. "Oren, what was that? What just happened out there?" He finally met my eyes. And what I saw there was not the righteous anger I had prayed for. It was a weary defensiveness. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Mom. Isolde, that's just her way. She has a very direct sense of humor. It's a bit sharp sometimes. You can't take it so personally." I stared at him, my hope beginning to curdle into disbelief. Humor? Oren, she called me a fat pig. In front of her parents. How is that humor? "She didn't mean it like that," he insisted, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. "It's just how they talk to each other. It's like a performance. They're always testing each other. It's a game. You don't understand their world. You don't understand." The words were another blow. He was siding with them. He was translating their cruelty into a language he thought I should accept, just as he had tried to translate my life for them. "I don't want to understand that world, Oren," I said, my voice trembling. "I want to understand why you said nothing. Why you stood there and smiled." "What was I supposed to do?" he shot back, his voice rising. "Start a screaming match in the foyer 10 minutes after we arrived? Ruin the entire weekend? This is important, Mom. This is my future. I'm trying to build a life with her." There it was. The word. Build. My son, the builder, was explaining that I was the part of the old structure that had to be torn down to make way for the new one. The foundation I thought we shared was just rubble to be cleared away. The cold, hard truth of it settled in my gut like a stone. My eyes fell on the cardboard box. What did they do with my gift? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He glanced at it, a flicker of guilt crossing his face before being replaced by that same weary defensiveness. "Fenwick put it away somewhere." Isolde said. "She said they don't really have a place for that kind of rustic dinnerware. We'll find a place for it in our apartment, okay?" Rustic dinnerware. My serenity set. My soul's work. Dismissed and hidden away like an embarrassing secret. He wasn't going to save me. He wasn't going to defend me. He was here to manage me. To ensure I didn't disrupt the perfect, cold order of his new life. He was asking me to swallow the poison so that his dinner party wouldn't be spoiled. You should get ready for dinner, he said, his tone softening slightly, a clumsy attempt at reconciliation. Just try to make an effort, Mom. For me. Please. He left. I stood alone again in the silent room, but this time, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the ghost of the son I had lost. The hope was gone, replaced by a clarity so sharp and painful it felt like a shard of glass in my heart. There were no excuses left. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. And he had made it. I don't know why I went down to dinner. Maybe it was a morbid curiosity. Maybe it was a final, desperate attempt to find a trace of the boy I raised in the face of the man who stood before me now. Or maybe I just wanted to see the full extent of the world I had lost him to. I put on the one nice dress I owned, a simple dark green silk, and walked down the long corridor toward the sound of muted conversation. The dining room was even more intimidating than the foyer. A long, dark mahogany table stretched out under a glittering crystal chandelier, set for 5 with an arsenal of silverware and glasses. Caspian and Lenora were already seated, sipping from delicate glasses. Isolde and Oren stood by a fireplace, laughing at something he had said. When they saw me, the laughter stopped. Isolde gave me a brilliant, predatory smile. "Elara," she said, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. "So glad you could join us. I do hope your room is comfortable." I simply nodded, unable to form words, and took the seat indicated for me. The dinner that followed was the most surreal and agonizing 2 hours of my life. The incident in the foyer was never mentioned. It was as if it had never happened. The conversation flowed around me, a torrent of names and places and concepts from a world I did not inhabit. They spoke of the upcoming regatta at the Oriente Yacht Club, of a contentious bid on a Basquiat at a recent Sotheby's auction, of a disastrous skiing trip in Gstaad. And Oren participated. He asked Caspian about his portfolio of emerging tech stocks. He laughed at Lenora's droll story about a dreadful encounter with a duchess in Monaco. He looked at Isolde with an expression of pure adoration as she held court, describing the complex tax implications of international art acquisition. He was fluent in their language. He was one of them. He belonged here. A few times, Isolde would turn to me, her eyes glinting with amusement. "We're so terribly boring, Elara, I do apologize. Do you get much sailing on Canandaigua?" The question was designed to highlight my otherness, to frame my life as small and provincial. "We have a few sailboats," I said quietly. "It's beautiful in the summer." "How lovely," she murmured, before turning back to the main conversation, my contribution dismissed and forgotten. I sat there, pushing a piece of perfectly cooked fish around my plate, a ghost at the feast. I looked at my son's face, searching for a flicker of unease, a sign of conflict, anything to show that he was still in there. But I found nothing. He was animated, he was charming, he was happy. He had seamlessly integrated himself into their world. And the price of admission had been his silence. It had been me. I was the toll he had paid to cross the bridge into their kingdom. Something inside me finally broke. I couldn't breathe the air in that room for one more second. I placed my napkin on the table. The small, quiet gesture feeling like an act of rebellion. "If you'll excuse me," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not feeling very well. I think I need to get some air." For pairs of eyes turned to me. Lenora's were coolly indifferent. Caspian's were annoyed at the interruption. Isolde's were triumphant. But it was Oren's eyes that broke my heart all over again. They were filled with a panicked plea. "Don't do this. Don't make a scene." I stood up and walked out of the dining room, my back straight, not looking back. I didn't go to my room. I walked straight to the front door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the cold, salt-laced night. The gravel of the driveway crunched under my shoes. I was shaking again, but this time it was with a desperate, liberating terror. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen. I opened a ride-sharing app, my location a bright, pulsing in a sea of darkness. Grey Marsh Estate. I requested a ride. My destination set for the nearest train station. Miles away. A car was 7 minutes away. I walked down the long, dark driveway, away from the light spilling from the windows of the great, cold house. I didn't want them to see me. I hid behind one of the massive oak trees that lined the drive, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Headlights appeared at the gates. A dusty Subaru Outback, a car that looked like it belonged back home, pulled up. The driver, a kind-faced man named Silas, looked at me with concern as I climbed into the back seat. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked gently. "I just need to get to the station," I whispered. "Please. As quickly as you can." He nodded and pulled away. As the car turned back onto the winding lane, I looked back one last time through the rear window. Grey Marsh stood silhouetted against the night sky, its windows glowing like malevolent eyes. My son was in there, in that house, laughing with his new family. And I was out here, alone in the dark, a refugee fleeing the ruins of the life I thought I had built. The foundation, I finally understood, had been rotten all along. The train ride from Penn Station back toward the Finger Lakes was a journey through a blurry, disconnected dream. I sat pressed against the cold window, watching the manicured suburbs of Long Island bleed into the dense sprawl of the city, which then slowly gave way to the rolling, familiar landscapes of upstate New York. Each mile that passed was a mile further from Grey Marsh, but the cold of that house had seeped into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the late autumn air. I was running, but the scene in the foyer was a phantom, sitting right there in the seat beside me. Isolde's voice. Oren's smile. The quiet, final click of the box lid closing. These were the ghosts I was bringing home with me. When I finally arrived at the small station in Geneva, the sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky. I took a local taxi, the driver's familiar face and easy questions about the weather feeling like they belonged to a life I had lived 100 years ago. As we drove the final stretch toward Serenity Falls, the late afternoon light caught the surface of Canandaigua Lake, turning it into a sheet of hammered silver. The beauty of it, a sight that had brought me peace for 30 years, now felt like a mockery. How could the world continue to be beautiful when my own had been so completely despoiled? My little house on Hemlock Creek was exactly as I had left it, quiet and waiting. The moment I stepped inside and closed the door, the silence rushed in. It was a different silence than the one at Grey Marsh. It wasn't the sterile, preserved silence of a museum. It was the heavy, aching silence of absence. The absence of my son's voice on the phone. The absence of the future I had envisioned. The one where our family grew, not shattered. I walked through the rooms, touching the familiar objects. The worn armchair where Alistair used to read. The collection of smooth stones from the lake on the windowsill. The faint, permanent smell of wood smoke and turpentine. This was my life. This was my truth. And it had been deemed worthless. I couldn't stay in the house. I went to my studio, the kiln. My sanctuary. The air inside was cool and thick with the scent of damp clay and the faint, metallic tang of the kiln. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool surface of my potter's wheel, the place where I had always been able to center myself, to find my equilibrium. I looked at the shelves filled with drying pots, the bags of clay, the buckets of glaze. This was my language. And my son had forgotten how to speak it. I sank onto the old wooden stool where he used to sit for hours, watching me work. The memory, once a comfort, was now an agony. I saw him there, a gangly teenager, his head bent over a textbook, the quiet company a balm to my lonely soul. I saw him as a young man, home from college, his face lit with excitement as he described a new design concept. Every memory was now tainted, viewed through the lens of that polite, vacant smile. The first text from him came the next morning. "Mom, are you okay? I woke up and you were gone. Call me." I stared at the message, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Are you okay?" The question was so inadequate, so completely divorced from the reality of what had happened, that it felt like an insult. I didn't respond. More texts followed over the next few days. "Mom, please. We need to talk about this." Then, "Isolde feels terrible. She says you misunderstood her." That one almost made me throw the phone against the wall. They were already rewriting the narrative, painting me as the hysterical, oversensitive woman who couldn't take a joke. His final text, after a week of my silence, was the one that truly sealed the coffin on the son I thought I knew. I don't know what else to do, Mom. I'm trying here. You're being really unfair. Unfair. I was being unfair. I turned off my phone. The silence that followed was a relief. Weeks passed. The brilliant colors of autumn faded into the stark, monochrome palette of early winter. I worked. I threw pots with a frantic, desperate energy, as if I could spin my grief and rage into something solid, something I could contain. But every piece I made felt wrong, misshapen. The center wouldn't hold. One bleak December afternoon, I was cleaning out a storage closet in the house, a task I'd been avoiding for years. In the back, under a pile of old blankets, was a dusty electronics box. Inside was an old tablet computer, one I'd bought for Orrin when he first went off to Cornell. He'd used it for a couple of years before upgrading, and it had been sitting in this closet ever since, forgotten. On a whim, driven by a sliver of masochistic curiosity, I plugged it in. The screen flickered to life, the battery miraculously still holding a charge. It asked for a passcode. I tried his birthday. Nothing. I tried the old passcode for our shared family computer. Nothing. Then I remembered a name he used to use for everything when he was a teenager. The name of his favorite structural engineer, Fazler Khan. I typed it in. The screen unlocked. It was a time capsule. Old photos, college essays, and a messaging app one didn't recognize. I opened it. It was still logged into his account. My heart began to pound. I knew I shouldn't look. It was a violation of his privacy. But what about the violation of my soul? He had denied me an explanation, a real one. He had offered only weak excuses and accusations. If he wouldn't give me the truth, I would find it myself. My finger trembled as I scrolled through his recent conversations. I saw the exchanges from the days after the incident. Him telling Isolde I had left. Her response? Good. It's for the best. She'll get over it. My stomach churned. I kept scrolling back, past the weekend at Grey Marsh, to the week before our trip. The screen was a blur of messages between them, full of pet names and plans. Then I saw my name. My fingers went cold. The conversation began on a Tuesday, 4 days before they were scheduled to drive up to Serenity Falls to pick me up. Isolde, have you thought any more about what we discussed? About your mother? Orrin, I don't know. It feels harsh. She's so excited for this weekend. Isolde, darling, be realistic. This isn't a weekend. It's an audition. My parents need to see that you are fully committed to this life. To me, your mother. She represents everything you've left behind. That cloying, small-town sentimentality. It's an anchor, Orrin. And if we're going to build the life we want, you need to cut the rope. My breath hitched in my chest. An anchor. Cloying. She saw my love for my son as a weakness, a liability to be managed. I read on, a helpless, horrified spectator to the dissection of my own character. Orrin. She's my mom. I can't just cut her off. Isolde. No one is saying cut her off. I'm saying we need to establish a new dynamic. A new hierarchy. Right now you are still her little boy from Whispering Rock. My parents will see that in a second, and they will see it as a fatal weakness. We need a clean break. A moment of absolute clarity where you choose, unequivocally, this world. Our world. Orrin. What kind of moment? Isolde. Something she can't misinterpret. Something that forces her to retreat to a respectable distance. We need to puncture the fantasy. Let her see that you are not her protector anymore. Let her see that you belong to me now. I felt like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. This was premeditated. This was a strategy. A cold, corporate-style plan for emotional demolition. My son's next message was a long paragraph of weak resistance, full of phrases like, can't we just talk to her, and she'll be hurt. Isolde's reply was swift and merciless. Isolde. Hurt is temporary. Ambiguity is lethal. She needs to understand that her approval is no longer a prerequisite for our happiness. Think of it as surgery, Orrin. One sharp, painful cut is kinder than 1,000 small ones. She needs to be put in her place. Gently, of course. Gently. The word was so grotesquely out of place it was almost laughable. I scrolled faster, a desperate, sickening feeling rising in my throat. I knew what I was about to find. And then I saw it. The final exchange, from the night before they drove to my house. Isolde, I have an idea for the introduction. It will be memorable. Shock and awe. No room for doubt. Oren. What is it? Don't do something crazy. Isolde, just a little piece of theater. A comment on her physique. Something so déclassé and brutal, she won't know how to respond. It will establish dominance immediately. The only thing you have to do is let it happen. Don't react. Don't defend her. Just smile. Show them, and her, that you are with me. Can you do that? For us? There was a long gap in the conversation. I could picture him, sitting somewhere agonizing. I could picture the war inside him. But I already knew who had won. The final message appeared at the bottom of the screen. A message from my son. The boy I had raised on a foundation of love and trust. The man who was supposed to build things that last. Oren, okay. I understand. Do what you have to do. The tablet slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the wooden floor. The world didn't fracture this time. It dissolved. Everything I thought I knew, every memory I had cherished, was a lie. The smile wasn't weakness. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't shock. It was complicity. It was a promise he had made to her. He had known. He had known what she was going to say, or something like it. He had stood there and watched the execution he had helped sanction. He had held the knife with her. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a conspiracy. My own son, my beautiful, kind boy, had conspired with a virtual stranger to emotionally destroy me, to break me down for parts so he could build his shiny new life. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest that made it impossible to breathe. It was a grief far deeper than the one I had felt when Alistair died. That was a loss to the cruel randomness of the universe. This was a loss to a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty by the one person I believed would love and protect me above all others. He hadn't just let the bridge between us fall. He had strapped dynamite to the supports and handed the detonator to Isolde. I sat there on the floor of the dusty closet, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, and wept. I wept for the boy at Whispering Rock. I wept for the mother who had believed in his goodness. I wept for the love that had been revealed as nothing more than a liability, an anchor to be cut away with a sharp, surgical smile. The question was no longer why he had let it happen. I knew why. The only question left, the one that echoed in the ruins of my heart, was impossibly, terrifyingly simple. After hearing the truth of his actions, is forgiveness even a possibility? I genuinely need to know what you think. The discovery on the tablet did not bring clarity. It brought a suffocating fog. The pain was no longer a sharp, piercing wound, but a chronic, systemic poison. I became a ghost in my own life. Winter descended on Serenity Falls, burying the world in a thick blanket of white, and the silence in my house grew heavy, deep, and absolute. I stopped working in the studio. The clay felt alien in my hands, the potter's wheel a monument to a life that was no longer mine. I would sit for hours in the old armchair, watching the snow fall, replaying the words from the text messages, the memory of Oren's smile, and the newly discovered, chilling architecture of his betrayal. My grief was no longer for the son I had lost, but for the son who had never truly existed. Days bled into weeks. Christmas came and went, marked only by the absence of a phone call. The new year arrived without celebration. I was adrift in a sea of gray, my anchor cut, just as Isolde had planned. I had moved beyond rage, beyond sorrow, and into a vast, empty landscape of numbness. There was nothing left to feel. The story, I thought, was over. The worst had happened. I was wrong. The worst was yet to come. It was a Tuesday in late January, the kind of day where the sky is the color of slate, and the air is so cold it hurts to breathe. A courier van, its tires crunching on the icy driveway, pulled up to my house. The driver brought a thick, heavy envelope to my door, requiring a signature. The return address was a law firm I had never heard of, Atherton, Kale and Sterling, with a prestigious address on Park Avenue. My first thought was that it was a legal threat from Isolde's family, a cease and desist letter to the mother who had dared to disrupt their perfect weekend. My hand trembled as I signed for it. Inside, the paper was heavy and expensive, the letterhead embossed. But the contents were not a legal threat. It was a collection of documents, held together by a single, formidable clip. And on top of the stack was a letter, printed on the firm's stationery but unsigned by any lawyer. The salutation was 3 simple words that stopped my heart. For Elara Vance. There was no mom. No dear mother. Just my name. I knew, with a certainty that made the blood drain from my face, that this was from Oren. This cold, formal package, delivered by lawyers, was his final word. His closing argument. My hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. I began to read the documents underneath the letter. The first was a copy of a bank statement from 28 years ago. It was from a trust account I didn't recognize. The account holder was Alistair Vance. The beneficiary was Oren Vance. There had been one substantial deposit. The payout from a life insurance policy I had forgotten even existed. And then, over the course of the following year, a series of large, systematic withdrawals, until the balance was 0. The second document was a copy of Alistair's will. I had my own copy, of course, tucked away in a lockbox. But this one had a section highlighted in yellow marker. A clause I had deliberately forgotten, buried under 2 decades of willful ignorance. It stipulated that the proceeds from his private policy were to be held in trust for Oren, to be used for his university education, and as seed money for his future, to be given to him upon his 25th birthday. The third document was a property deed. The deed to my house. The deed to my studio, the kiln on Hemlock Creek. And attached to it was a loan document from a private lender, dated 6 months after Alistair's death. The loan had been taken out by me, using the property as collateral. It had been used to pay off the staggering medical debts Alistair's illness had left behind, debts that would have otherwise forced me to sell our home. The final document was a statement showing that this private loan had been paid off in full, just 2 weeks ago. The debt had been purchased, and the loan satisfied, by a holding company. A holding company registered to 1 Caspian Atherton. I sank into the nearest chair, the papers sliding from my lap onto the floor. The fog of numbness was instantly burned away by the searing, white-hot light of a memory I had spent my entire adult life trying to suppress. It all came rushing back. The crushing grief of Alistair's death, compounded by the terrifying mountain of bills. The letters from the hospital, the bank, the threat of foreclosure. The nights I spent at the kitchen table, sobbing, convinced I would lose everything. Our home, the only place Oren had ever known. And then I remembered the insurance policy. Alistair's secret provision for his son. I had known what the will said. I knew that money was Oren's. But he was only 10 years old. His future felt abstract, distant. The threat of homelessness was immediate, visceral. So I made a choice. In my panic and my grief, I told myself a story. I told myself I was protecting him. I reasoned that keeping a roof over his head, preserving the stability of his home, was more important than a number in a bank account. I went to a lawyer, found a loophole, and as his legal guardian, I used his inheritance to save our life. I paid the debts. I kept the house. And I buried the truth so deep I almost convinced myself it had never happened. When the time came for him to go to Cornell, I told him I'd received a series of lucrative commissions for my pottery. I told him my work was paying for his education. I let him believe I was a successful, self-sufficient artist, a hero who had provided for him through her own talent and hard work. I let him build his admiration for me on a foundation of a profound and devastating lie. With trembling hands, I picked up the final letter. Oren's letter. I began to read, and with every word, the world I knew was unmade, then remade into a shape of unbearable, tragic clarity. Elara. It began. I imagine you are confused. Let me provide the explanation I could not give you in person. For my entire life, you have cultivated a story. The story of the strong, resilient widow, the brilliant artist who built a life for us from mud and fire. You let me believe our foundation was built on your strength. You let me revere you for it. I see now that this story was your greatest, most enduring creation. When Isolde and I began planning our life together, we started with our finances. Her family, as you know, is meticulous. They requested a full accounting of my assets, my history. When I couldn't produce the trust statements my father's will mentioned, they hired an investigator. It didn't take him long to find the truth. He found the insurance payout. He found the withdrawals. He found the secret loan you took out to save the house. He found the lie you have been telling me for my entire life. Do you have any idea what it feels like to learn that the sanctuary you grew up in was paid for with a future that was stolen from you? That the mother you idolized built her independence on the back of your inheritance? You didn't just spend the money. You erased it. You replaced it with a myth. A myth that made you the hero and me the eternally grateful son, indebted to your sacrifice. But there was no sacrifice. There was only theft. The weekend at Graymarsh was not about introducing you to them. It was about reintroducing me to you. Isolde's words. They were not some random act of cruelty. They were surgical. She saw the truth of you with a clarity I was too blinded by love to possess. She called you a pig because you had feasted on my future to sustain your present. The insult wasn't about your weight. It was about your character. And my smile. You have been haunted by my smile. You should be. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was the smile of a man watching a perfectly constructed illusion finally collide with an inescapable truth. It was the smile of a son acknowledging, for the first time, the full, breathtaking scope of his mother's deception. I did not stand by while she attacked my mother. I stood by while she exposed a stranger. The foundation was rotten, you see. But it wasn't ours. It was yours. And it was built on my father's grave. The Athertons have purchased the remaining debt on the house. Consider it a final gift, a severance. You are no longer burdened by that secret. You are free. And so am I. Do not try to contact me. There is nothing left to say. Oren. I held the letter. The paper was limp in my hands. The room was silent. The snow fell softly outside the window. The story was not about a cruel daughter-in-law and a weak son. It was not about class or money or a mother's love being rejected. It was about a lie. A 20-year-old lie. Told out of love and desperation, which had festered in the dark until it had grown into a monster. A monster that had finally come home and devoured everything. He hadn't betrayed me. In his mind, in the cold, clear, brutal logic of his new world, I had betrayed him first. And everything that had happened, every cruel word, every silent smile, was not an attack. It was a reckoning. The letter was a bomb that detonated in the quiet center of my life, and the fallout was absolute. It did not just destroy the present. It radiated backward, poisoning every memory, every cherished moment, turning them into evidence of my own profound deceit. Oren's childhood, our walks by the lake, the shared silence in the studio, it was all recontextualized. I had not been his protector. I had been his debtor. My love, which I had believed was a pure and elemental force, was tangled up in a transaction I had hidden even from myself. The narrative of my life, the one where I was the resilient artist who had weathered the storm of grief, was a fiction. The truth was messier, uglier. I was a thief. A well-intentioned one, perhaps. A desperate one, certainly. But a thief nonetheless. For days, I could do nothing but sit with this new, terrible knowledge. I was no longer the victim. I was the origin of the wound. The cruelty at Graymarsh had not been an unprovoked attack. It had been a response. A calculated, brutal, and, in their eyes, entirely justified retaliation. My humiliation was not the crime. It was the punishment. They had held a mirror up to me, and the reflection it showed was not of a loving mother, but of a woman whose entire identity was built on a lie she had told her son. I thought of him as a boy, telling me his dream of building bridges. All the while, I was the one dismantling the very foundations of trust upon which any real bridge could be built. He revered me for a strength that wasn't entirely mine, admired me for a sacrifice I hadn't truly made. When he discovered the truth, it must have felt like discovering the core principles of physics were a lie. The ground beneath his entire life had given way. His anger, his coldness, his alliance with Isolde, it all began to make a terrible, heartbreaking kind of sense. He hadn't abandoned me. He had recoiled from a fraud. The numbness that had protected me was gone, replaced by a shame so profound it was a physical weight. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. The house, now technically free and clear, felt like a prison cell I had built for myself. Every wall, every floorboard, was a monument to my deception. The kiln, my sacred space, felt profane. How many times had I sat on that stool, covered in the honest dirt of the earth, while living a dishonest life? The hypocrisy was suffocating. One morning, after a week of this self-imposed purgatory, I woke up knowing that I could not live this way. The grief for my lost son was now overshadowed by the grief for my own lost integrity. Oren had said there was nothing left to say, and perhaps for him, that was true. But not for me. I couldn't undo what I had done. I couldn't give him back the money or the 20 years of truth I had stolen from him. But I could do the one thing I had failed to do from the very beginning. I could be honest. I went into my studio. My hands felt clumsy and foreign, but I forced myself to work. I took a block of dark, iron-rich stoneware, a clay known for its strength and its flaws, and I began to wedge it. The physical act of kneading the earth, of forcing out the air bubbles and aligning the particles, was a kind of prayer. I wasn't trying to make something beautiful or perfect. I was trying to make something true. I centered the clay on the wheel, and for the first time in months it felt right. My hands remembered their language. But this time, I wasn't creating a delicate, ethereal piece of porcelain. I was shaping a simple, thick-walled vessel. A kintsugi bowl. In the Japanese art of kintsugi, broken pottery is not discarded. It is repaired with lacquer mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum. The philosophy behind it is that the breakage and repair are part of the object's history, something to be celebrated rather than disguised. The cracks become the most beautiful part of the piece. I threw the bowl, let it dry to a leather-hard state, and then with a heavy heart and a steady hand, I took a hammer and I broke it. The sound of the pottery shattering echoed the sound of my own life breaking apart. I carefully collected the pieces. There were 7 of them. I fired them, glazed them in a simple, dark tenmuka glaze, and then began the painstaking process of repair. I spent days mixing the lacquer and gold dust, fitting the broken pieces back together, tracing the lines of fracture with shimmering gold. Each golden seam was an admission. Each line was a confession. This crack was the lie about the money. This one was the pride that kept me from admitting my desperation. This one, the largest of all, was the betrayal of his trust. When it was finished, the bowl was whole again, but it was not the same. It was a web of dark ceramic and brilliant gold, more beautiful and far more honest than the original. It was a map of its own destruction and rebirth. It was my apology, my confession. It was the truest thing I had ever made. I packed the kintsugi bowl with more care than I had ever taken with any piece of my work. I found a sturdy, plain wooden box and nestled the bowl inside on a bed of soft linen. Then, I sat down and wrote a letter. Not to Alara Vance, but from her. My dearest Oren, I wrote. There are no words to undo the lie I told you. There is no excuse for the foundation of our life being a secret I kept from you. I was drowning, and I used your future as a life raft. I told myself it was for you, to give you a stable home, but that is only half the truth. It was for me too. I was terrified and ashamed, and I took the easy way out. And then I spent the next 20 years building a story to hide that cowardice, even from myself. You deserved a mother who was strong enough to be honest. I am so sorry that I was not her. Your letter was the hardest thing I have ever read, because it was true. You did not stand by while a stranger attacked your mother. You stood by while the truth finally, brutally, caught up with her. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I have no right to it. Forgiveness cannot be demanded. It can only be offered. And I know I have not earned it. I am sending you this. It is a kintsugi bowl. It is a Japanese tradition that treats breakage and repair as part of the history of an object, rather than something to hide. The cracks are where the beauty is. This bowl is my life. It is the story of my profound failure as your mother. The golden lines are my confession. They are the truth, finally brought into the light. It is all I have left to give you. Whatever you choose to do, whether I ever hear from you again or not, I want you to know this. The love I felt for you, the pride, the joy, none of that was a lie. It was the one true thing in a story that was not. And I will love you, my son, for the rest of my days, even if it is from a distance. I hope you build a beautiful life. I hope you build bridges that last. With all my love, your mother, Ilara. I sealed the letter and placed it in the box with the bowl. I did not send it via a courier from a law firm. I drove it to the post office in town myself and sent it to his address in the city. The act of letting it go, of sending my confession out into the world with no expectation of a response, was terrifying and liberating. I had finally stopped running. I had finally told the truth. I went home and waited, not for his forgiveness, but for my own peace. The days that followed were different. The silence in the house was no longer heavy with secrets. It was just quiet. I started working in the studio again, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a slow, meditative purpose. I started making more kintsugi pieces, finding a strange solace in the act of breaking and mending. I was starting to mend myself. About a month later, a small, unassuming package arrived. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw the return address. It was from him. Inside, there was no letter. No explanation. Just a small, velvet-covered box. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a single, perfect, celadon-glazed porcelain bowl. One of the 7 from my Serenity set. It was the piece of my soul I had tried to offer as a gift, which had been rejected and scorned. He had kept one. Or he had gone back and retrieved one. It didn't matter. It was here. It was a message. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't a promise of reconciliation. But it was a response. It was an acknowledgement. It was a single fragile bridge stone, placed carefully in the middle of a vast, silent chasm. Knowing what you know now, about my lie and his reaction, would you have seen the warning signs? Would you have understood that the perfect facade of a mother's love could hide a crack that would one day threaten to shatter everything? The single celadon bowl sat on the pine table in my studio, a small, quiet testament to a future that was no longer completely foreclosed. It was not a happy ending. It was not a neat resolution where all wounds are healed and all wrongs are righted. Our story, my son's and mine, had been broken too severely for that. But holding that small piece of my own work, a piece I thought had been lost to the cold indifference of Grey Marsh, I understood that this was something more real. It was a beginning. The beginning of a long, uncertain, and painstaking process of repair. It was the first golden seam in our own kintsugi story. I did not hear from Oren for a long time after that. Months turned into a year. I did not reach out. The ball was in his court. The next move had to be his. I had said my piece, offered my confession. Now all I could do was work on my own foundation, to become the kind of person who was worthy of a second chance, whether it ever came or not. I threw myself into my work with a new kind of honesty. I stopped trying to create perfect, flawless things. My pottery became more elemental, more true to the nature of the clay. I embraced the imperfections, the slight asymmetries, the unexpected ways the glazes would break over the texture of the form. My work became a reflection of my new understanding, that strength is not the absence of flaws, but the courage to integrate them into your story. People responded to this new work. My pieces began to sell with a regularity that surprised me. They weren't just buying pottery. They were buying the stories the pieces told, the visible histories of stress and survival. The kiln on Hemlock Creek, once a quiet sanctuary, began to find its voice in a wider community. One crisp afternoon in early autumn, 2 years after that fateful weekend, a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. It was not a sleek silver import, but a modest, practical sedan. A man got out of the driver's side. It was Oren. He was alone. He looked thinner, and there were lines of weariness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was no longer the boy I remembered, nor the cold stranger from Grey Marsh. He was someone new, someone forged in the crucible of a hard truth. He walked toward the studio, his steps hesitant. I met him at the door. We stood there for a long moment, the chasm of 2 years of silence stretching between us. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice quiet, almost hoarse. "Oren," I replied, my own voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. He held something out to me. It was a small, crudely shaped object made of air-dry clay, the kind you buy at a craft store. It was a lopsided, misshapen bowl, his fingerprints clearly visible in the surface. It was painted a clumsy, uneven blue. "I made this," he said, a faint self-conscious smile touching his lips. It's not very good. The center wouldn't hold. My eyes filled with tears. He remembered. He remembered our language. The center wouldn't hold. It was his confession. His apology. His way of saying that his own world, the one he had tried to build with Isolde, had been fundamentally unbalanced. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, I said, and I meant it. He told me slowly, haltingly, that he and Isolde were no longer together. The foundation of their relationship, built as it was on a shared act of calculated cruelty, had proven to be as rotten as the one he had accused me of building. The power dynamics, the constant testing, the transactional nature of their affection, it had eventually corroded everything. The performance had become exhausting. He had discovered that a life built on demolition requires you to keep destroying things, until eventually, you turn on each other. He had walked away. He was working for a smaller, non-profit firm now, designing community housing. He was building again, but this time, he was building things that connected people, not things that impressed them. Our reconciliation was not a single conversation. It was 100 small ones. It was him, sitting on his old stool in my studio, watching me work. It was me visiting his small apartment in the city. Seeing the kintsugi bowl I had made him sitting in a place of honor on his bookshelf. It was the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust, one honest word at a time. It was an acknowledgement of our shared brokenness. We were two imperfect people, a mother who had lied and a son who had been complicit in cruelty, finding our way back to each other across a landscape of wreckage. Our love was not the simple, unbreakable shield I had once imagined it to be. It was something far more complex and far more resilient. A choice. A choice to see the cracks in each other, and to love not in spite of them, but because of them. What is your ultimate take on this? On the nature of betrayal, and the possibility of forgiveness? Let me know in the comments below. I am reading every single one. And if you found my story shocking, wait until you see the other stories we've uncovered on this channel. Stories of secrets and resilience that will make you question everything you think you know about the people you love. There are forces in this world like Isolde, people who see vulnerability as a weakness to be exploited, who believe that human dignity is a currency to be spent for their own advancement. They thrive in the gray areas, in the unspoken agreements, in the polite silences of those who are too afraid to cause a scene. They build their kingdoms on the quiet humiliation of others. The only power we have against this kind of casual, soul-crushing cruelty is to stand together and declare that it is unacceptable. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in the power of honesty and compassion. Only those who would side with manipulation and deceit would refuse to join our cause. I'll see you in the next one. And always remember, at Virtuous Stories, we love you.